The biggest crisis facing each and every one of us is the looming environmental catastrophe. Now, for some, it seems far away and ethereal as a concept, despite the evidence being overwhelming that the crisis is already here. For other people, it must be a great big hoax, perpetrated by the big money folks who derive enormous profits from pushing solar panels and paper straws. And for others, it's a looming crisis that threatens everything they hold dear to the point where action seems futile and the future seems too bleak to contemplate. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications person at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. Environmental psychology is about an awful lot more than just the environment. Climate change and reducing our consumption of coal and gas and oil and plastic. It's also about the way we interact with our environments, the way we feel when we enter a room, the way a restaurant might be laid out to encourage us to buy dessert, or an office might be lit to make us feel happier at work. On today's episode of Mindful, we're going to discuss all of those facets of environmental psychology with the expert I trust most to break it all down.
I'm Dr. Lindsay McCunn. I'm a professor of psychology at the Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, in British Columbia, Canada. And my training is in environmental psychology, and I just finished within the year a second graduate degree in applied neuroscience. So I'm kind of splitting my time between environmental psych and applied neuro. Yeah, and I'm the chair of the environmental psych section of the CPA.
And I believe you're now a very prestigious journal editor as well, right?
Yeah, very honored to have a editor-in-chiefship, I suppose, with Dr. Wes Schultz in California of the Journal of Environmental Psychology, which is arguably the premier journal in the field. Such a lovely job to do, to see all the new research that comes in all the time from all the different aspects of environmental psych, which, as you know, is a very interdisciplinary discipline and merges with so many other fields and scholars. So getting to read all of the new lit it's a lot of work, but it's beautiful work.
You know what? Actually, I want to start this off by talking about environmental psych. We're going to talk about the environment a little later on and a new publication and that sort of thing. But what I really like to do first is just delve a little bit into environmental psychology for those who don't know what it is, right? Most of us, I think, we hear the words environmental psychology and we assume that it has to do with climate change and the environment around us and saving the planet from all of the terrible things that we humans do to it. But it's a lot more than that. So I'm hoping you can just explain what it is that you do on a regular basis.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you've got it mostly right. So environmental psych is it's a relatively young subfield of psychology. So it's not maybe as classical or traditional as, social or neuro or cognitive or developmental psych. But in the last 6 decades or so, really this idea of transactions between people and place has become more formal. So we study, the field started off by studying how people interact with, work settings, built environments, architecture, moved into, hospital design, prison design, working with city planners and architecture experts and so on, trying to figure out what some of the tenets of humane design are. Because, of course, we spend so much time indoors, even more so now than when the field started. And it's only rational and completely justified to expect that the environment affects us and our mood and our thought processes and our behaviors just as much as social interactions do. So traditionally, people would feel like psychology is a social field, and it is, but it's also important to pull apart that environmental piece and study that as a variable in relation to how people are as individuals and as groups. And so mostly, and there are a handful of us that still study, the built environment and traditionally understand things like stimulation theory. So how lighting and acoustics and thermal comfort, other things affect us in buildings of all sorts, and then make recommendations to architects and planners and designers and engineers about what to do about buildings to make it more satisfactory to people to be inside them.
And is that what you mean by the phrase humane design? Like you've designed it in such a way that the lighting and the way that things are laid out inside that building makes people feel better when they're in that space?
Exactly. Yeah. To make sure that health and well-being are considered in the design so that we're not just designing for economy or something else, need for some other purpose, especially using public dollars for public infrastructure. It's important to care for the user. And this idea of social design and the goals of social design are very much linked to that. Wayfinding as well, and just other things that lower stress, especially in buildings that are naturally very stressful, like airports and hospitals and so on, where you are naturally going to have a higher level of anxiety. We want to sort of take the low-hanging fruit of what can we do, about the design of those areas to make people feel better. And then recently, of course, with the problem of climate change, it's really important to augment the field of environmental psych to include topics about conservation and pro-environmental behavior, pro-environmental attitudes, eco-consciousness, and sort of see how they link up so that we can give good evidence-based advice to policymakers and governments to make sure that we can combat this problem of climate change together.
And I imagine that's where the two sort of branches of environmental psychology intersect, right? And the notion that, okay, I'm going to build a brand new building and it's going to be very eco-conscious and there's going to be a garden on the roof and we're going to run a lot of stuff based on the energy we accumulate through solar panels, and we're going to have, I guess, less stuff going on inside that wastes a lot of energy and that sort of thing, right? And maybe the lights will turn off at night and it won't be lit up all night long when you drive by it on the highway, right? But how do we design it in that way so that the person inside also feels very good about being in there? And is that as simple as, well, this building is really environmentally conscious and it does a great job of, not wasting a lot of energy, and it improves the environment by growing cucumbers on the roof or whatever? Like, is that enough to make somebody feel better about being in that space?
Well, it depends on the values of the people in the space. It's so interesting. There's a lot of literature on integrated design and how it's important to ask the people who are going to be using the building or who are using the building about what their values are, so that you can align the design with what those are, so that they come to work or home or whatever the building is, feeling encouraged and empowered to make environmental decisions and to sort of be their best selves in relation to the environment that they're in. And I think it is a really complex process, though, because it's really tough. As any architect or designer knows, it's really hard to please everyone, and we all have different adaptation levels and locus of control and sense of controllability and territoriality and personal space tolerance and all of these things that make us individually ourselves. And so it becomes sort of the job of a broader social scientific inquiry to try to measure all of those things and understand them and give good recommendations to designers, depending on the context of what's going on inside.
I was thinking about this a couple of days ago. I was in one of these tech offices, and for those people in Ottawa, no, it wasn't Shopify. It was a different one, similar like that, right? And I thought, like, this is what you see in the movies when they want to make a sort of ridiculous space for a tech company, beanbag chairs and hammocks, and you can take a scooter from one meeting to the other and that kind of thing, right? And they're really, really trying to push getting their employees to go back into the physical office to work. And I was thinking, like, that's a really interesting situation where you've created this space ostensibly to make your employees as productive and happy as possible when they're in that space. And yet they still would prefer to work from home for the most part. And getting them to come back is a difficult thing. But now you've built it. And now you say, well, I spent all this money on it. Please come back to work so it wasn't a waste of money, right? I imagine that's a situation a lot of people are now in, given the last 2 years of the pandemic, where we've all become very comfortable wearing jogging pants.
Yeah, especially if we've made adaptations to our home to make it so that we can work more productively. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, I think I was talking to you about this at the very beginning of it, where part of the shock of having to sort of move your work environment to home was sort of the lack of environmental competence you had. Like, I use the example for me when I came home from, the campus environment where all of my books, traditionally, the professor's office, like all the books are on the wall, and I just pulled them whenever I needed them. And then I came home, to the house that I'm renting, and I can't just put up all these bookshelves, and I didn't have all the resources. And I felt that sort of, such a stark difference between what I needed from my work environment to complete my goals and to sort of behave the way I needed to, and what I had at home. And then over time, it sort of accumulated all that I needed and became adapted to working from home. And I think it is interesting that, offices in particular have to sort of come up with incentives to get people to come back, especially if the commute is long. We did a study, I won't talk about it too much because it's not published, it's not quite done, but I was working with an engineering team at UW during the pandemic. And then one of the team members happened to be from Indonesia, and they noticed that some of the Indonesian companies and offices were asking people to come back really early on, retrospectively in the in the COVID process. And so we did this study about environmental trust of the occupants to see whether all of the bells and whistles that these offices were putting in place for safety, like, extra hand sanitizing stations and extra HVAC information pamphlets about how clean the air would be, and, almost security guards at the door executing compliance-based sort of guidelines about, oh, did you wash your hands? Did you come in and, did you take a test and so on? And we measured how comfortable people were. And the results are a bit tricky because, it was a tricky time to be asking people questions. But yeah, it seemed like people were a bit almost more scared because of these extra measures than they would have been otherwise. But yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's the kind of thing that you get used to. When the pandemic first started, I do some work with a charity here in Ottawa that helps homeless youth. And it's not something that you can do virtually. You can't do this remotely. They have to come in because they have no place to Zoom from, right? Have no home, right? So they come in and they have a hot breakfast at the drop-in, and attendance fell like crazy at the beginning of the pandemic because we do have that security protocol at the door, and there's somebody who's checking your temperature, and there's somebody who's signing you in and asking if you have any symptoms, and you have to wear a mask when you're in there and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of people immediately said, no, that's not what I'm used to from this organization. I don't want any part of it. And I'm out, I'll find somewhere else to go or be. But over the last 2 years, we're now seeing more than we ever had before. Now, part of that is because there are more people experiencing homelessness, but it's also because a lot of the youth that we saw became quite familiar with that system and that protocol. And yeah, no problem. I signed in. Yep, take my temperature. Yes, I'm wearing the mask, right? And none of the protocols have changed. None of the procedures have changed. Still the same. But I think that people develop a comfort level with that over time. Does that make some sense?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. It was interesting to sort of watch that, not from the same example in the center, but even something so simple as watching people sort of have a sense of reactance against having to stand so far apart in line at a coffee shop at the beginning. It was sort of like, oh, I want my humanity back. Ironically, I want to stand where I want to stand. And people were very, sort of unsure of where to go unless there were stickers on the floor and so on. And I noticed that came in quite quickly to help people behave in the program of a space. So environmental psych, and to some extent industrial organizational psych, we talk about the program of a space. So that's basically, what does the space and the design need to be in order to help a social norm happen, or in order to communicate to the users what should happen in that space. And so in obviously a coffee shop, it should be obvious from where the furniture and fixtures are what you should do in what order, right? To get what you need done, to get your goal attained in that space. And so, and also there's this idea of staffing, like how many people inside is enough to get that program to be successful and not feel awkward or, weird or anything. And so with the, social distancing at the beginning, people had not adapted. And so it was sort of, nobody was sure what to do anywhere and where to stand and how many people should be in a space. And if it was, unsafe or safe to step in or step out at certain times. And it was just interesting watching that as an environmental psychologist, watching that happen wherever I went in my community, at least the places that were open, and then watch it slowly become almost the norm to stand very far apart from someone, or to even know that, the dots are gone now. Like in my university, there were dots saying which way to go in the hallways and so on. People still adhere to that, I think, out of either habit or just precaution, I guess. But it's interesting. It took, less time than I assumed for people to adapt, for sure, which gives me some insight as an environmental psychologist about the general adaptability of people. I think we study it, but without a situation or circumstance where we actually get to see it naturalistically. Yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting time.
Yes. No doubt. It is interesting. And I remember I go to the same grocery store all the time. It's the one that's near me. So I'm very familiar with its layout and the way, right? And they put the arrows on the floor. So you go up one aisle and down the next, and everybody followed that pattern as you go through. So I developed a very, repetitive pattern every time I went. I did it the entire store in the exact same order that, right? And I went up and down every single aisle, even if I didn't need, graham cracker crumbs or what. But when they took the arrows out, I found myself really irritated with anyone going the wrong way in the aisle. And, and then it took me a while to realize the arrows had been removed because I was so used to, taking that same route through the store.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in terms of, the environment itself, the impact that we have on the environment, over the course of the pandemic, a lot of buildings did have to retrofit themselves in one way or another, better ventilation and that kind of thing, in order to become safer for people, exposed to a respiratory virus. But did we miss a larger opportunity to sort of retrofit those buildings in a more environmental way? Have we, could we have done more over the course of this 2 years when everything was changing in such a big way to move ourselves in the direction of a more environmentally conscious infrastructure?
I don't know. I mean, I hope that if an organization had the means to sort of do, piggyback onto something that they were changing, like our university, our building did make renovations to the HVAC system, but I think that was it. And I think that's all they decided to do, probably because the expense was surprising. What's interesting, though, maybe in some buildings, if they did do, say, an upgrade in the HVAC, if they could take the opportunity to choose HVAC systems that were more environmentally friendly, say, and really dealt with some of the particulate issues we talk about now that we have, wildfires happening every year because of climate change issues, and sort of the public worry that, for good reason, that the particulate is very damaging to our lungs and our respiratory system. If they could have maybe educated building users, and some buildings probably have done so, to say like, hey, we made this, HVAC upgrade for public health reasons because of respiratory illnesses, but also because of, any instances of wildfire, depending on where you are, I suppose, in the continent. But it draws awareness to the fact that they can either, trust the building and trust these sort of green environmental movements that happen in design, and raise awareness about why it's important to care about the environment and to maybe make some different choices about how we behave environmentally so that we don't need these precautions so much, but also just to show that, that renovations can be done to help the situation and to help us adapt to the differences in the climate and in public health issues. Yeah.
Now, is there a good way to deliver that message? Because I must admit, whenever I hear somebody tell me this is very green, this is very good for the environment, this is excellent, I immediately have a little skepticism in the back of my head. And I think, okay, are you greenwashing, or is this in fact real, that you've actually made an effort to become more environmentally conscious? And am I helping, or are you just hurting a little less than what you were before, right? And I see it a lot in commercials. I think right now that there are commercials about oil and how much it helps the environment. And I think, okay, that's, I think clearly something to be skeptical of, right? So is there a way, for cynics like me to convince me to send the message when you have retrofitted your building that in fact this is for the best? Do you need to put all the specs out there? And
yeah, there's got to be a mix. Like, some people really like that feedback, and it is true that sort of data and evidence can get people to really believe, especially if they've got that sort of lean towards skepticism, or just expect data to explain to them the extent to which something has helped, and not just that it has or it hasn't, but how much. And this idea of like low impact versus high impacts and behaviors toward the climate change issue. They want to know whether something is a low impact thing or a high impact one. And to them, maybe it makes a difference if something's worthwhile doing. So I think, the idea of smart buildings is really neat, and you can get, smart homes and apps where it'll tell you, basically real time what the air quality is in the house, what the energy use is, what the plug load is, what solar is coming in if you've got that hooked up, what your water use is, and so on. And I think that can sometimes be overwhelming. Like sometimes people look at it and go, oh, well, do I need to be an engineer to understand this? If you can sort of balance it so that anybody can look at it and understand their usage and whether or not it's making a difference. The one thing is that you shouldn't just give usage data and expect someone to interpret it well. You should give usage data and then compare it to what's expected or what a particular goal is. There's been studies about people feeling better about their environmental behavior if it's compared against their neighbors. So we're sometimes inherently competitive and not so cooperative. We want to go, yeah, we're going to beat neighbor Jim over there. He's got water use like this. We're going to do better than neighbor Jim, things like that. But I think actually the public buildings like our university and, other hospitals and airports even and other things where it could show real data about how the building is doing and sort of back up this idea. It's like, oh, you say you're sustainable and you say you're green. The regular consumer is not going to be able to see those, those LEED certification checklists unless they post them, I suppose, or, whether something qualifies for the Living Building Challenge and so on. Like those qualifications are rigorous and they do have, science behind what they're asking buildings to do. But to communicate that to people, I think not only can be really influential in terms of getting people to feel trusting in the building and what it's doing, but also getting them inspired and maybe relating that back to their own life. Like when I see, larger public buildings doing lots of engineering things and saving energy, I kind of go, well, if a larger building can do that, and if there's an organization that's invested in that kind of decision, to make changes in their infrastructure, what can I do at my home to tweak my, my water use or, harvest the rainwater, or, unplug things, or getting something going with my kids to, to turn off the lights and so on. Like for some reason, understanding that larger systems are making those changes I think it just personally takes the pressure off me as an individual to make all of the good decisions, and instead makes me a little bit more enthusiastic about doing that in my own life.
Now, what about if, you're in your office and somebody comes in and says, the company in the office next door recycles a lot more than you and turns their lights off at the end of the day and doesn't jack the heat up. So, would that create a similar competitiveness? And also, on a similar topic, if my neighbor is a slob and doesn't recycle at all, sorry, okay. My neighbor's a slob. He doesn't recycle at all. He puts out 16 garbage bags every garbage day, but none of the green bin, none of the blue bin, none of that. Does that make me less likely to do any of those behaviors because I don't need to be the good one on the block? Anyone's better than Jim next door?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the dragons. Dr. Gifford put out this wonderful paper, sort of the dragons of inaction, so explaining some of the barriers to pro-environmental behavior that people have and sometimes don't even realize they have, which is why the paper is, I think, so enlightening and engaging for many people who read it. But yeah, so one of the ideas is that this sort of social comparison, like, well, if this person is doing, the bare minimum, then I'm good to do what I'm doing. So, or why should I go over and above when everyone around me is not? Sometimes this can happen in like a family unit where one person is really gung ho about climate change or sustainability, but then they sort of get worn down by the inactivity or the anti-attitude by the, family members or roommates and so on. Same with organizations and, coworkers who want to do the right thing and then, others who don't comply. And so things get a little bit less so, I guess, over time. But yeah, so social comparison can be good sometimes if there is sort of this sense of active competition where another person is trying to do their best and you can see if you can one up them. But it depends on personality too. And that's one other good thing about environmental psych is that maybe because it's so young, we've been able to sort of piggyback onto other fields that exist in psychology. And personality theory is sort of a long-standing one where we can take some of the ideas we have about why people do things the way they do and why they don't, and relate them to things like extroversion and introversion and openness to experience and neuroticism and agreeableness and so on, and other aspects of personality where we find that people will generally behave in a way that aligns with their personality. So, for example, like I'm not the most extroverted person. And so I find that if there was a protest or a rally or something, even though I might have the right attitude and I might believe in that cause fully, I might not behave in that way. I might write a letter, or write an article and submit it to a magazine or journal, or do something more introverted. And I think often when we think about getting people to behave, it's just as important to maybe align those options with the different types of personalities and people that we've got to make sure that their behaviors can be just as impactful, but definitely something that they feel comfortable doing.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned that after a while, right? Let's say somebody else in your house or your office isn't displaying the same level of, interest in environmental behaviors that you are. And over time, that can wear you down. Would you call that burnout? Is that what that is? And I'm wondering if it's the same thing with people who initially were really into complying with public health measures when COVID hit, but over time start to go, oh, no one else is wearing a mask. Why should I? Even if you still believe you should, you might stop doing it anyway because other people are just not doing it anymore, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's this element of learned helplessness where, you might feel like, well, I tried and I really care, but it's not really making a difference, especially if you see your peers not following through with something that you care about a lot. And then you feel like nothing matters. Nothing that you do has any efficacy, or you don't have any efficacy to change things. And it's good that you brought that up, because that's one of the problems that we see. It's sort of a tipping point between things like, when people feel eco-anxious, eco-anxiety is becoming quite prevalent, and tipping that over into, severe depression about the environment, and having almost, a big sadness, or a feeling of despair and loss about the opportunities that we had to get the environment back to the way it could be for us to be all right, or for future generations. And so this idea of learned helplessness is kind of, you don't want to get there. You want to feel, feeling anxious and worrying about the environment can be productive in many ways. It can get you to act and be the type of person to, to be a bit more of an activist, to get things to change if the enthusiasm is high. But once learned helplessness becomes part of the equation, it might be that people become so anxious about the problem that they stop doing the behaviors that really would help, and also feel maybe more generally helpless and alone and upset about the prospect of the climate in general.
Right, kind of the like, am I the only one who cares about this still kind of thing, right? Is that okay? I'm wondering if there's a fine line there. I mean, is that something, if that's something that you're experiencing, that you feel super anxious about the climate and the future of all humanity and so on, is there something that might be happening that would be a warning sign, like you're crossing into an area where eco-anxiety could be a real problem? Maybe you should step back or see somebody and get some help.
Yeah, I used to talk to a lot of clinicians about this. I haven't talked to them in a few months, but I feel like they have seen an uptick in this, where people, start to sort of understand that their worrying, no longer sort of makes the difference that they want it to. And they talk to their friends, and their friends aren't sort of worrying to the extent that they are. And they, a lot of times, at least in my experience, people who I've sort of seen tip over into this, not quite despair, but to the point where they're no longer behaving in a way that's sort of proactive, I suppose, about the environment, is that they've started small, and they thought that they, by doing small changes in their behaviors, that they would gain confidence and sort of gain encouragement by their friends and their family and in themselves to sort of do larger and larger, more impactful changes, like, if I pick up 5 pieces of garbage from the beach, then, the next day or the next week I'll pick up 10. And you realize, though, that, the amount of garbage is the same and it doesn't go down. And you would end up feeling so responsible for picking up so much more and so much more to meet your feelings of responsibility or your goals that you've set for yourself, that you just all of a sudden tip into, well, I'm not going to do it at all. And then, things get worse emotionally for that person. Mm-hmm. Or if you feel like you start, riding your bike in the summer and I'm doing so well. And then, the cold weather hits or the snow hits and you go, well, I'm not going to do it at all. And then it just stops, right? And then at that point, people can become a little bit more upset maybe than if they were just to be consistent. And so sometimes doing a little bit, but consistently, could sometimes be maybe better advice than to say, start small and get bigger. But
yeah, and I wonder if some of that despair comes from disinformation and conspiracies and that sort of thing, right? Every now and then you talk to a friend who surprises you by telling you that, oh, the planet just warms in cycles and it's just like it was in the 1800s, and climate change is a hoax because David Suzuki has money or something, right? I mean, there's always something nonsense about it, but a lot of people believe this stuff. And I was thinking about this and this will be published a little bit later, so I'll let people know that we're having this conversation just a couple of days, or the day after the US midterm elections. And I saw a tweet thread from a woman who had been running for Senator Congress in Missouri. And she was talking about how she would go and knock on doors and talk to all of the constituents that she wanted to represent and say, I'm from the Democratic Party. And before she could get that out, that she would hear about how her party eats babies and how, well, we need to put Jesus in classrooms and we don't, right? And just something that you really can't fight against in that moment. You cannot explain to somebody that, well, no, that isn't happening, right? And you can't explain to somebody, well, crime's actually gone down in this area and not up, because they hear it, it's reinforced all the time. And just the threads she was writing, and she came out of it, more committed to fight than ever. And I thought, I don't think I could do that. I think if I had gone and knocked on all those doors and every person who answered the door told me that, I murdered babies and ate them and was running a satanic pedophile ring, that I don't think I could continue to go knocking on doors. I feel like I would just stop and say, politics isn't for me. This is over. You know what I mean? So I'm just wondering if that's part of it, right? This sort of concerted effort out there to minimize climate change, and in many cases to invent theories as to why it's not real.
Yeah, I think a lot of discredence and distrust of science has really muddled the picture for a lot of people. And also just the fact that we're not really hardwired, like Dr. Gifford says in his Dragons paper, like we're not really hardwired neurologically to be thinking about things that are going on, in a large climate scenario in other parts of the world for other people that don't affect us in our self-interests, or risks or threats that will be, taking effect in 3 generations time or 1 generation's time. It's easier for us to understand what a proximal risk is, or something that will happen next year or next month, and things that really scare us, and especially messaging that tells us that we have to stop our way of life and change our quality of life, or our livability or our habits. The messaging really needs to be showing us what we need to do in a positive way, and not sort of be that nanny state-esque tone where we ought not do these things, and this is what the scary thing will happen if you don't do it. People don't really respond very well to those types of messages, and so I think early on, and I mean, there's a lot of environmental psych, decision-making science research that's out there to say now how to message to get better, more positive attitudes and compliance to occur. And so Absolutely. I think, yeah, if we look at those things and sort of understand how to visualize things for people, so that when, if we see what a coastline will look like in a town in 10 years if we do nothing, versus if we do this much or this much or this much in terms of whatever it is they're trying to adapt to, and not scare people to death, but also really help them form a sense of place and some place attachment and some civic fortitude together as a community to work together, then I think we'll have better results. And then maybe people will trust the science a bit better if the evidence is given to them in particular ways that's accessible and non-disputable. And I think that it's just a matter of communication.
Definitely. But attachment to a place, I like it. That's brought us full circle, as I have just under 4 minutes left, and we haven't actually spoken about the reason that I asked you to be on this podcast. So let's close this out with Climate Action and Global Psychology. This is a book that you and our CEO, Dr. Karen Cohen, collaborated on a chapter, and I'm hoping you can just give me a brief overview of what that chapter is about and your contribution to this book.
Karen and I wrote sort of dually. Karen wrote about some of the contributions that CPA had made at a meeting, I believe in 2020, where a lot of psychological associations got together and talked about climate change and the role of psychology in addressing the problem of climate change. And what a wonderful and yet compelling and challenging issue that was to do, but how nice it was to reflect on all of the things that CPA has done already. And one of those things was the section that I chair, the environmental psych section. Some of us got together and wrote, as a sort of a task force, wrote a position paper for CPA for the board to approve, which they did, to take to governments to say what some of the literature has said already about what psychology can do in the face of climate change, and give some recommendations about how to spend money and fund some of the research. And one of those recommendations, and based on the literature that's becoming more and more deep in our body of literature and all of the lines of inquiry that we've got going on, is the impact of nature and why it's so important to encourage a sense of place for people to sort of build a relationship back with a landscape or a place, whether that's a community or a coffee shop or a beach or a mountain or a park. The ability to access those places frequently and build a bond emotionally, psychologically with a place is part of that gap between getting people to care and then getting them to behave based on that caring. And if there is a gap between attitude, eco-conscious attitude and pro-environmental behavior, then one of the ways to bridge that gap is to get people to have an emotion about what they're trying to steward and what they hope to save. And so place attachment was always, I think, popular because it's so relatable and experiential and emotional. And almost everybody feels some sense of place attachment to somewhere. But it is becoming more and more of an important variable to study with respect to getting people to act and behave in a way that can help the environment in the long term.
Thanks to Dr. Lindsay McCunn for taking the time during a busy reading week to talk to us today on Mindful. And thanks to you for tuning in, streaming, or downloading today's episode. Remember, Mindful can be found wherever you get your podcasts, and the next episode is in 2 weeks' time. Today's episode was written, hosted, and recorded by me, Eric Bowman. It was produced and edited by Jamie Montgomery. And our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.